Welcome to Capturing Global Insights, Quester's webinar. Our focus today is on translating worldwide and localized consumer needs, specifically around bottled water. My name is Thatcher Schulte. I'm a vice president here at Quester. Earlier in the year, we conducted a study to look at the distinguishable differences between bottled water consumption and attitudes around brands in 5 different countries. The study was initially designed in order for us to test our methodology in different countries. Today we'll spend some time talking about some of the key insights associated with worldwide bottled water consumption, as well as localized distinctions between language. We'll also spend some time talking about some metrics that distinguish the individual countries themselves. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about today's agenda. First, we'll focus on the goals of today's webinar. I'll focus on 3 things that I hope we can take away through the conversation. We'll also discuss a little bit about why we chose bottled water as a category to look at worldwide differences. We'll then focus in on the case study, spending a little bit of time on the countries we actually went into and the individual kind of topics that we went over and what our hopeful kind of outcomes were of the research. At the end of the day, we hope we can take away some key insights that are both worldwide in terms of what are the things that make kind of bottled water consumption universal, as well as what are some distinguishable differences in terms of consumption and branding within the individual countries. I'll then spend a little bit of time talking about the methodology for which we collected the interviews, and that'll lead into some cultural idiosyncrasies. Some of the unique elements of our methodology is that it allows us to kind of capture some unique metrics in terms of how we can go about conducting online qualitative in different countries. The goal of Quester overall as a business is to really improve the way in which the industry conducts online qualitative. So hopefully some of these metrics will be valuable as we move forward. So let's focus on the goals of today's webinar. We'd like everyone to take away 3 key kind of elements as we move through the presentation. The first one is that you can actually take in-depth qualitative exchanges and turn them into business decisions or insights. And really that's the kind of overall arching goal of today's webinar. Our second is that there are distinguishable differences between individual countries that make branding or how the product needs to be formulated, how those are actually a little bit different in individual countries. And then there's some universal insights that exist across all of the brands. And finally, we want to talk a little bit about how we can improve engagement in different countries, how you might need to approach a Spanish respondent differently than a German respondent, different than an English-speaking American. So why did we choose bottled water? Well, to start off with, in 2010, $99 billion in global sales was the total market for bottled water, and the information collected here was from a Data Monitor report that was released in May of 2011. Now, in May of 2005, the same business released some projections. First of all, they said in 2005 that the global market was around $66 billion, and they predicted by 2010 it'd be about $75 billion. Now, this information is a little bit unique in the fact that by 2010 it actually outgrown the consumption expectations. So there's something very specific about or unique about a brand or a market that grows a lot faster than what's predicted. And something is unique about either the formulation, the purity, the cleanliness, the way in which it's convenient that really distinguishes bottled water from the first most highly consumed beverage in the world, which is soda. So let's start off with a couple of facts. The first fun fact is the United States is the largest consumer market for bottled water in the world, and we have a little bit of information that can give some insight around why that's such, as well as why Mexico falls in line at number 2. More importantly, though, as it pertains to the kind of localized insights, in the United States, bottled water costs range between $0.25 and $2 per bottle, while tap water costs less than a penny. So there is something very specific about why people are able to or wanting to spend more money on something that's primarily freely available. So let's talk a little bit about the case study where we conducted the survey and a little bit of some of the results that we actually found. Now, to start off with, we have over 1,200 respondents. They were conducted in 5 different countries. First, we started off in the United States, where we talked as a control with over 300 English-speaking respondents. And we've been doing this kind of interviewing in the United States for about 10 years. As a way to test whether there are any distinguishable differences between different languages in the United States, we also spoke to 105 Spanish-speaking United States residents. And we wanted to compare those folks again to the Mexican respondents, the Mexican market, and we had 207 respondents there. We then moved up to Canada, where we've been doing interviews for about 6 or 7 years, and we focused primarily on French-speaking Canadians. And we wanted to look at the distinguishable differences between that country and France, where we talked to 150 respondents. And we finished up with over 300 respondents in Germany. So we wanted to look at a couple of different areas of the world, as well as look at some of the distinguishable differences between languages as well. Our respondents are 18 to 65. They purchase and personally consume bottled water in the past 3 months. So we're looking at regular consumers of bottled water. And our method was an online qualitative interview. In many cases, this is called an in-depth interview or an IDI. They were about 10 minutes in length, and we conducted what we call a benefit laddering exercise, which is a fairly typical qualitative exercise. We started off with talking with respondents about the brand that they drank. So we really wanted to focus in on the specific brand that consumers are going towards. What is their brand? Because we wanted to have very specific stories. So we started with there and then laddered up. We wanted to understand what are the benefits. Typically, what are the functional benefits of bottled water overall? Keeping it focused on the brand that they would actually consume themselves. From there, we laddered it up to how the brand makes them feel. We wanted to understand some of the emotions. And finally, we capped it off with a very qualitative conversation and asked respondents to tell us a story about consuming their brand. And there were some really great stories. We even had a Spanish respondent who talked about the idea that their brand of water helped save their lives by making them a healthier person overall. So we like to try and kind of encapsulate some of the key insights. I'll try to do this relatively briefly, but if we look at across the world, what are some of the key insights that people talked about that were really universal? We have some 6 or 7 major kind of conclusions here. First of all, the major benefit of bottled water is refreshment, and refreshment has kind of a dual meaning. The first one is obviously physical refreshment. Why do you drink water on any given day? It's primarily for hydration from physical exertion on a hot day or after they've been doing some exercise, or it's satisfaction from feeling refreshed. There's a feeling of relaxation, or they can feel refocused on the day. So there's a dual kind of physical as well as emotional kind of definition around a refreshment. And really a brand that's not positioned around refreshment is going to have some limitations. The most desired flavor, how people talked about the ideal taste of their bottled water, was this idea of it being pure or clean. And a lack of flavor, no taste of minerals, no aftertaste, or a completely neutral taste, is really the way in which they define what pure or clean means. And those indications of no flavor, no minerals, no aftertaste, that indicates purity and cleanliness. And that's ultimately the primary driver for purchasing bottled water over tap, that pure or clean taste. Bottled water across the world is considered to be healthy. Obviously, it helps with hydration, digestion, and it's healthier than the world's most consumed beverage, soda, which is often compared against. Price is a concern, even though it is freely available, and so that was kind of a unique finding that, from our perspective. People look for economical bottled water, look to purchase in bulk in certain shopping situations, and this really does differ, and it points to the fact that it's really important to understand channel management and the way in which different consumers purchase different bulk purchases. And that differs by country and region and whether you're in a rural or city environment. All of those things kind of lay into how people are going to be looking for bulk purchases. And bulk purchases are really the primary way that people look for economical savings. So that was consistent worldwide, although it did differ depending upon the type of respondent we were talking to. And finally, globally, brands really do matter. They have a pure definition. They can be defined through formulation, through the way in which it's positioned, but primarily they're driven locally, and this is where we get into the localized insights around brands. Brands at their core are defined by what makes sense to a country's sensibilities. So oftentimes, branding in a country often kind of stands in line with what people in general think of that country. So let's start off with the first kind of country that we looked at. It's probably got the most unique story out of the individual countries that we looked at. And here we have 207 Mexican respondents speaking to our software in Spanish. So the primary thing that is a positioning or set or need to understand in Mexico is the idea that water needs to be secure, water needs to be safe. And if we look at what the respondents here say, not everyone has the opportunity to consume good water here, and with spring water, I feel safe. So a clean taste is very important as it pertains to bottled water. Tap water in Mexico can taste like chlorine, so when the water doesn't taste like tap water in Mexico, it seems safe. And bottled water gives consumers a feeling of a sense of security. And brands can help support security. Brands that are well established have proven that they're secure over time, Or when a brand is backed by a large corporation, say for instance like Coca-Cola, there's money and distribution behind it, so that also establishes trust in the mind of a Mexican consumer. But once the security has been established, brands can then go about and establish themselves as well. So here we have a respondent token about Bonafont and how it, helps them feel healthy. One of the unique things that we found in Mexico was that bottled water is universal worldwide, but a need for low sodium isn't. There is a unique kind of desire out of Mexican respondents that they want water to be low sodium. Certainly it needs to be good and healthy for me and hydrating. It also helps with weight control, and that's consistent worldwide as well. But the unique focus on low sodium in Mexico is very differentiating. Once the brands have established themselves in Mexico, they can then go and look at the positioning statement. Bonafont is the market leader in Mexico, and it's really connected to itself to an idea of healthy with the benefit of being beauty. They even have positioned their product around that idea of being beautiful. Their logo reinforces the idea. Consumers notice it. They talk about the advertisements with the young, beautiful people. And the conclusion that people are even trying to reach, even as it constitutes with the kind of slender logo, is that Bonafont consumption will indicate, first of all, that it's water and I'll be healthy, but ultimately I'll be beautiful. If we look at the distinctions between Spanish speakers between the individual countries, it really is about the country. Since the primary concerns in Mexico are about security and that has to do with the infrastructure, when Spanish speakers are in the United States, they don't really communicate the same kind of needs. Concerns lessen. There's less concerns around security, around purity, around the need for a large corporation, concerns about sodium content, and ultimately they begin to talk much more like Americans, English speakers in the United States, and there's a stronger focus on great taste. If we move over to Europe and spend a little bit of time in Germany, they also have a kind of unique way of looking at branding. So there are three distinguishable differences in how people look at water and its taste and needs in Germany, and we've kind of rolled them up here to give you a really quick baseline. In Germany, there's lots of brands, more brands than in any of the countries that we talked about, and really it's about the localization of the sourcing. In fact, there's people talking a lot about knowing the proprietor, knowing the location of the stream, and therefore then being likely to drink that brand. One of the things that makes Europe unique, and particularly Germany unique, is that carbonation is kind of a key need around some water brands. It's not in all waters, but it does happen, and the carbonation does change the flavor profile. Rather than it just being pure and clean, there's also the idea that they want it to be crisp, but there is concerns around overfilling, so they want to make sure that it has the right kind of carbonation content. So when carbonation is combined with clear natural flavor, you really get the best taste. And finally, nutrition standards in Germany are very exacting, as you might expect. Hydration is physician recommended. So Germans believe they have a very specific need in the required consumptions amount and the mineral content they're going to look for. So they look to be exacting as they try to meet those levels. So that's one of the key distinctions that separates Germany. I do want to focus on point one a little bit further because we did have a lot of brands mentioned. In fact, we had over 80. We had nearly 30 or 40 mentioned twice or more, and then we had another 30 or 40 that were just single brand mentions overall. And you start to see from some of the respondent verbatims really why that is so, and it does a lot tie into that localized sourcing. It tastes good, it's a taste price ratio, but comes from the region. I know the proprietor. So there is something very specific about the location of the sourcing of the water itself. As we move to France, we see a similar story, but in France, that was really where water branding was born, and we see a lot of these stories. Now, I pulled this example from Wikipedia to give some sense of what a specific story might look like. In 1789, this is about Evian. During a walk, the Marquis of Lasserre drank from the water of St. Catherine's Spring in the land of Marcachet. The Marquis, who was allegedly suffering from kidney and liver problems, drank regularly of the water while he walked and claimed that his health improved. And these deep, rich brand stories really exist behind a lot of the brands that exist in France and really drive a lot of the reasons why there's brand preference. If we look at the brands mentioned in France, each of them has kind of a distinguishable story. Evian obviously is world famous, but Cointreau, and I believe I'm saying that correctly, It was first thought to be consumed in 1774. It has exacting amounts of calcium, a differentiating brand proposition. Volvic is seen to come from a volcano sourcing. Vitel was first consumed in the 1860s. Perrier, something well known in the United States, was seen to come from a spa in Roman times when it was first drank. So there are these very long histories tied to very specific sourcing in France. But that has changed over the last 10 years a little bit. Even though there's these kind of stories about, I had it when I drank it from when I was a child, it was sold in glass bottles. The leading consuming brand has actually changed since then. Brands and their traditions matter, but the new players have kind of changed the model, and this is an example of one of those, and the brand's name is Crystalline. Now what Crystalline has done unique is that it's driven a lot more consumption and more favorability in France in the last few years, and people talk about this. It's more economical, and the reason why it's more economical is that they've identified multiple sources around the country, which these other brands aren't necessarily doing. What they did in the positioning of the product is they went out and identified local sources and then slapped the same label and branding on top all of those. And as you go and explore a little bit further about Crystalline and their brand positioning, they still undercut the infrastructure or how people are getting water to their homes, ultimately kind of bad-mouthing tap water in terms of it's not having kind of that deep well experience from the waters of France. So even though they have changed the model a little, they've still lived up to that brand reputation, that brand story that makes French bottled water a little bit unique throughout the world. When we looked at French speakers between France and Canada, we found some distinctions, certainly sparkling as absent, but the language may not be all that these two kind of speakers share. Brand sourcing still matters in Canada with French speakers. There's pure Canadian springs. People talk about glacial or snowmelt waters, distinct natural northern sources. So the sourcing still matters in Canada. If we move finally over to the United States, we can talk a little bit about what makes branding in the United States unique. And this is not very different than other products and services available in the U.S., but it is very unique to the different countries that we saw. American brands really have definitive meanings. So as we looked at the people that consume these individual brands, there were consistent distinctions that were defined by the brand's positioning or formulation. And formulation actually does really matter around in the United States because cachet can matter. If we look in particular at something like Fiji or Smart Water, the formulation of the product or the packaging itself can help distinguish and set apart that brand and give the brand a clear definition, and also, like I said, provide cachet. If we looked at the folks that, the largest brand consumed in the United States, at least in terms of this study, Aquafina is seen to have a superior taste to all other brands, and that's why people drink it. Dasani is seen to be available almost anywhere, which speaks to Coke's distribution model. Nestle is seen to be, often the lowest price or most economical, which is not uncommon if you go into grocery stores in the U.S. and you find that Nestle Pure Life is often the most affordable. One of the unique brands that we looked at was the folks that drank Poland Spring. Now, all of the products themselves are talked about in terms of being healthy or being good for exercise, but Poland Spring often comes packaged with kind of a pop-top bottle. And so more commonly when we look at the Poland Spring consumers and their discussion of the brand, we see exercise mentioned more frequently because it doesn't have the typical screw-off top. So we always want to try and finish up with our studies as best we can to give some go-dos or so-whats. So what can you do with this data? To start with, a brand positioning that's not focused on refreshment, and more specifically pure refreshment, it's not going to be successful. Now, many people might say that this is kind of a standard or cost of entry into the discussion. But what we found in the discussions throughout is it's going to be essential for you to communicate it in some fashion, whether it be with that Bonafont brand with the water splashing behind it or the water's moving through an Aquafina bottle. Refreshment still needs to be communicated, if not overtly said. Across all brands as it relates to distribution and channel management, it's really important to understand shopping behavior and the shopping behavior of certain channels. So as we looked at the major insight of price being still an issue, it's very important to look at how people look for bulk purchasing options to help them save money. For manufacturers in the U.S., brand plays a very important role. It's perhaps the area where brand plays the most important role in terms of distinguishing between individual products. It helps build credibility, but it also builds cachet. And in that regard, celebrity sponsorships, not unlike Jennifer Aniston as it associates with Smartwater, package innovation or product innovation, those are really going to be what helps cement differentiation of branding in the marketplace. So your product has to be known for something to build a market within the US. For manufacturers in Mexico, safety communications are initially the most beneficial to new brands, since water security is really paramount. So building relationships with water boards, consumer safety committees, investing in water purification standards will all be beneficial to a brand's growth. In Europe, tradition can hold well-established brands, but for our upstarts or large manufacturers entering the marketplace, invest in localized sourcing and bottling is going to really be essential. Additionally, we saw this more so in Europe because of the way in which households are kind of set up, way in which kind of space is limited. Distribution and channels management really matters. People talked about how large the boxes they would be able to purchase, how many bottles they'll be able to purchase, whether the bottles are easily carried. All those things are going to be really important to understand as brands look to be involved in those marketplaces. The last one is kind of a self-serving message, and it really is listen to your customers. It's important to find their stories and find innovation through their behaviors and attitudes. So as you listen to customers talk about their consumption opportunities, it's really important to learn what kind of stories might exist for individual brands. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about the methodology. The methodology we used to conduct the surveys is they were moderated by a virtual moderator, Socrates, and they were conducted online in what we call kind of a chat interface. Each respondent saw those 4 topics and on average received about 1 probe per topic. Respondents shared with us personal stories about their brand, and they also explored emotional benefits associated with the brands that they consumed. In order to do our analysis, we actually conducted what we call a linguistic analysis to identify the key themes, and that was performed by both software and an analyst. And we looked at cultural distinctions between different countries, and we looked at language distinctions. And I'll show you a little bit of that data as we move into the cultural idiosyncrasies of the way in which people are kind of conducting online qualitative in the individual countries. So one of the first kind of metrics we looked at was how long did these interviews take? And what we found was that Spanish speakers were more likely to spend more time online talking to the software. 15 minutes on average for US Spanish speakers, 13 minutes on average for Mexican speakers. And I'll note that drops down a little bit in Europe, but the quickest interviews that we saw were conducted in the United States with English speakers. And that's particularly unique as we move forward. Spanish speakers were the most verbose, which is indicative of how long the interviews took, but they really did spend a lot of time talking to us. They spent a lot more time typing words and were a lot more kind of open and sharing with that information. Now, I did mention that United States English speakers, that sample of 301 were the fastest or were the quickest interviews that we had. They were around 8 minutes. But we see their word count total to be much higher than in France and Germany. We have some reasons why that's a little bit lower as well. In the United States, we found that English speakers were the fastest typers out there, and in France and Germany, they were some of the fewest words typed overall. And in the U.S. Spanish speakers, there were some of the fewest words typed per minute as well, but they also shared the most amount of information with us. Now, all of these factors are metrics. They're not necessarily indicative of whether or not the conversations were good or bad. We really saw some key insights and stories throughout all of those, but we're also looking to pass along some learnings that we found in terms of how you can better generate better conversations in the individual countries. So we do have all of our unique peccadillos. Things are different in each of our countries. One of the things that we found that may be driving the lower word count overall in Germany is that a single word can capture several ideas. So in German has some of the longest compound words in the world, which can lead to a lower word count. So if you think in the United States, the word like cannot that can be combined, Germans do the same thing, often at a very kind of dramatic way, and this is actually a word in German not necessarily communicated in the survey, but we did have very long character strings of words in German. In Europe, we found that professional interviewing is essential. There's not really a need to build a relationship with a respondent or be casual. Now, I'll take a step back and talk about how interviewing in the United States is a little bit different. In the US, we've been doing this for about 10 years, and we often talk about building storytelling or asking respondents to be fully engaged, giving them positive feedback as they move along. And that's not really essential in Europe. And we found that we needed to kind of refocus the way in which some of our topics operated. It's important to be direct and be specific about what you want to learn. And it's not really necessary to be overly personal with respondents. In German, we also found that there were some concerns around follow-ups being seen as interrogations. So again, what we would promote is to be direct and not to overly personalize the probing methodology, and instead focus on facts rather than experiences. As we looked at that kind of tell me a story about your brand, that's often seen to be translated as kind of like a fairy tale in German. So it's much more important to say, tell me a personal experience you had with this product. In France, respondents can be impatient and get irritated quickly. So again, we find it's important to be brief and be professional and ultimately be direct. Spanish speakers require very fewer topics because they're very open, respond well to sharing, and engage in very personal and conversational dialogue. It's not uncommon for the first response to an opening topic with Mexican respondents or Spanish speakers in the US to be a very long paragraph full of many points of detail and a lot of conversational context. And finally, this isn't necessarily something that we've learned just in this study, but it's something that stays consistent with what we've seen over time. And that's Americans, they need probing. Otherwise, they'll really operate in a lazy or undisciplined fashion. They won't type in a lot of language. So if they don't have to type, they won't have to. So it's really important to find unique methodologies, both in the way in which you formulate a question as well as how you create follow-ups and connections between topics to help generate better and longer, more responsive feedback. So thank you for listening to today's webinar. We hope you found the information helpful, and please visit Questor.com for further information.